We're going to start Deuteronomy. We're going to try to look at Deuteronomy for the next couple of weeks. We'll probably do 1 week of some pre-high holiday stuff. I will send out a reminder to the class that we will have class for the next few weeks. And then after Sukkot, we'll start a new topic. Deuteronomy is interesting for many reasons. And when we talk about authorship, if there's one book that we probably know more about its authorship, it's probably Deuteronomy. Most likely because it was written later, significantly later. And we're going to look at that a little bit.
Page are we on?
We're going to be on page 1303 in a moment. Most likely, Deuteronomy is composed of 3 different sections, which Friedman's going to call I have to go back and look, but DTR1, DTR2, and DTN. And we'll talk about what those mean at some other point. But I want to actually start with some historical context about Deuteronomy. So, what do we know about Deuteronomy? Forget the authorship for a moment. From a content perspective, what do we know about Deuteronomy?
It's a recap.
Yes, it's a recap. What's its other name? It actually has another Hebrew name besides Devarim. It's actually called the Mishnah Torah, right? Which is, if you will, the second telling or the second teaching of the Torah. As if to say, what we had before was Torah Part 1, and what we have now is Torah Part 2. What else do we know about Devarim?
It's the last book of it.
It is the last book of what we're going to call Chamishah Chumshei Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Who's the audience? According to the text.
Those who are going into Israel.
And how is that different from the previous books?
Well, we're a generation or just we're further down the line in generations.
Good. So we're not in the patriarchal period anymore. We're clearly away from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But more specifically, this is not the generation that left Egypt. What happened to the generation that left Egypt?
They've died off.
Most of them have died in the wilderness, or they were so young when they left Egypt that they may not have recollection of what the Exodus looks like. What else do we know about Deuteronomy? Who speaks in Deuteronomy?
Moses.
Primarily Moses. There's very little God-centric directional speaking. Meaning it's not, and the Lord says to so-and-so. Although you'll notice which name of God appears most frequently in the book of Deuteronomy? Phil?
Yahweh.
That's right. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Adonai. Not El. That doesn't mean that El doesn't exist or appear, but more frequently than any other name, we'll see the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Tetragrammaton. Why is it that Moses is speaking and not God?
Because he's instructing, he's summarizing, he's reminding.
Great. Instructing, reminding, he's preaching to a new group of people. I like to think of Deuteronomy as Moses' swan song, if you will. Whereas Numbers, the book of Numbers occupies about 40 years of history, the book of Deuteronomy is about 2 to 3 months. And so it's basically their position on the other side of the Jordan. They're about to go in, and Moses kind of stops them and says, you know what, guys, before you go in, I wanted to get on my soapbox for a couple of months, and I just want to tell you everything you need to know. Which is mostly tell you everything you're not supposed to do, or tell you everything you're supposed to do differently from your previous generation. What else do we know about Deuteronomy? What's its content? If we are repeating things, what would we want to highlight?
Shared history.
Shared history, a lot of rules. There's a ton of laws in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? There may actually be more laws in the book of Deuteronomy than there is anywhere else in the rest of the Torah combined. What else?
Does he bring up new laws for the first time, or is everything that's gone before?
I would say you could make an argument that some of the laws are new and that some of them are actually coming kind of in a repeated way, but slightly different.
Okay.
There is a huge ethical component to Deuteronomy. You're going to hear over and over and over again something along the lines of, you got to take care of the stranger and the orphan and the widow and the vulnerable. Why? Because you were strangers in a strange land. Over and over and over again. You're going to get this idea of what we'll call ethical monotheism, that part of believing in one God requires an ethical form of practice. And historically speaking, if we were to put Deuteronomy on the historical timeline, what time period would we say is covered in the book of Deuteronomy?
Well, let me just ask, why do you say that? Why can't you have a lot of gods and have a lot of ethics to go along with it? I mean, why does monotheism and ethicalism coincide?
They don't necessarily do in the broader world, but Deuteronomy seems to be moving us in that direction. I'll give you an example. What is the predominant statement of faith in Judaism?
God is one.
The Shema.
Shema.
The Shema. Where does the Shema appear in the Torah?
Ten Commandments.
Which version? The first one in Exodus or the second one in Deuteronomy?
The second.
The second one. We have no real affirmation or statement of faith around one God, with perhaps the exception being the Ten Commandments, until we get to Deuteronomy. So why is it only at the end of the Torah that we have this Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad?
Took a while to convince us.
Huh?
Took a while to convince us.
Well, not only that, we're trying to convince a different group of people at this point, right? It's the new generation, not the old generation. I'm not suggesting that you're wrong, Jerry. I think you are right, that there have been moments about this before, and that you can have ethical understanding of how to live with multiple gods. But for whatever reason, the Torah seems to move us in the direction of oneness in Deuteronomy that we haven't seen before.
No, I know that, but that doesn't mean ethicalness. I mean, they're two entirely different things.
Correct.
They were ethical way back before the Torah, too. Before ancient civilizations were ethical.
Yes.
So why is monotheism ethical?
Oh, I see.
Could I comment on
Yeah.
that? This may be naive, but
Maybe I'm being naive.
no,
I
I don't know. I
understand.
mean, let me just respond to the issue that at least in a lot of the older civilizations that we know of, in which there were multiple gods, the gods were not working together toward a common goal. They were in contention with each other, and their actions were not specifically carried out to gain a sense of peace and wellness and fulfillment for each other or for themselves, but they were to gain superiority over one another. So I think the model of a polytheistic society is a society in which whichever God you're going to be putting on top has to be given preeminence, and therefore that implies contention. When there's one God, then presumably, and this may be naive, if you can, everybody can, in theory, work together to satisfy the goals of that one God. And if that God is an ethical God, then ethics maybe derives from that. But where there are many gods, I don't think it's so easily possible to have ethics because there's contention.
Or you can have ethics without God. You don't need God.
Yes,
Well,
that is
but
true.
that wasn't your question.
Yeah, that's for sure true. I think that's a good answer. I really do.
I think are you asking why do you need a deity with secular humanism?
I just don't understand why monotheism is such a great thing. What's the difference? All these gods, you can make them believe it or think anything that you want them to think. And some can be ethical and some not. What's the difference? I mean, monotheism and being ethical don't coincide with me. I don't get the connection.
I agree with you. And I don't necessarily know that they need to. I actually think you're right. I don't know that you need a God to be ethical. I think the challenge is that we're talking about a worldview where everyone had a God. And the competition around one's belief in one God or multiple gods often got in the way of ethical practice.
And it appears to be the first religion that in its theology, that it was central to the theology. So for example, in other religions, like Asian religions, you do find ethics buried into the religious principles.
You're reading all this stuff in the Torah here, and God makes these crazy requirements. You got to kill people for doing this, and kill everybody, and annihilate everybody, and slaughter animals. Where's the ethical?
Actually, Jerry, I think you're right, and I agree with what Rabbi just said too. I don't think you have to believe in a single God to be ethical. In fact, you'll find many atheists are ethical people. So it's not required that you'd be ethical to believe in one God. On the other hand,
Well, then
if you follow all of God's commandments, you're going to be an ethical person.
Not necessarily.
Not
I think from what Jerry's asked,
you're going to be
arguing,
killing
you'd
each
say
other
no.
if you follow
Well, no,
God's
not
commandments.
if you follow the Ten Commandments.
But we would
You won't.
say they're two separate but related goals. One is, it's a good thing to believe in one God, and the second thing is, it's a good thing to be ethical, and we're marrying the two. But you could have one without, either one
Yes.
without the other.
Yeah,
I completely agree with that.
You're not addressing your actual original question, which is what's the difference in ethical behavior between a polytheist and a
I
monotheist?
appreciate what you said. No,
I don't take
understand.
issue at all with the idea that you don't need a God to be ethical.
Yeah.
It's just that is it easier to be ethical in a polytheistic society or in a monotheistic society if that's your only choices?
I understand.
And yeah.
So can I jump in? So I think the prophets directly answer your question. I mean, Isaiah, who throws out the priests and, claims that all the kings and all the Messiah and that none of them are doing what God has commanded them to do. And his causal reason is because they're failing to be ethical. But this is the key. He was a Yahwist prophet. And what he's saying is that unless that God commands you to follow these ethical rules, and if you don't do that, then you're going to suffer punishment. And that's not the only path to ethics, but that's how Jews did it. And that's the history that we carry to today. And that's why you find a lot of Jews and non-prophets. And, there's a tradition of ethics in the religion, and that's not in every religion. But it
You
is in
find a
other
lot of
religions.
Jews in prison, too.
Yeah, but that
Not as many.
not as many, right? It's only statistical.
By the way, I don't know that that's because they do or don't believe in one God or more
No.
than one
They're
God.
not
No, it's
following the
because
Ten-
white collar
they're not
crime
following the
isn't
Ten Commandments.
pursued as
So
heavily
actually,
as
Jerry,
drug crime.
I think you're raising a really good point, and part of what's complex about the Torah is figuring out what is the God that you believe in. Because I don't know that the God of the Torah is the God that I believe in, and I also don't know that the God of the Torah is the actual God. But I wonder if I just said that on camera, right? Okay. But here's the interesting thing.
I'm into that.
Part of the reason why we're having this class is not to try to understand who is God, right? That's a different class, which we should probably have at some point. However, this is the human understanding of what they think God is, which, by the way, I think gets to part of your point. There are people who do believe that their God would say we should behave in this way, which we might say is unethical, but they think is totally fine, like killing lots of people. And so I wonder how much of this, if it was written by human beings, is a reflection of what they believe God would want them to do. One God, two gods, multiple gods, no God, with an image, without an image, that eventually the rabbis of the rabbinic period are going to reject altogether. Right? A lot of the things that you're talking about, which we struggle with in the Torah, the rabbis say it either didn't happen or we don't do it anymore for that reason. And so I wonder if what Deuteronomy is trying to pose for us is maybe some of the things that we have done before are not the way of what it would mean to be in relationship with God. And we should actually push forward, and this is what Phil's talking about with the prophets, the ethical piece. Right? Maybe monotheism is actually not about the belief in one God. Right? But it's about the belief in a certain central fabric of principles about how one behaves. And that's exactly what the priests are fighting for. Forget sacrifices, forget following this, do what the right thing is, whatever that is. And so I wonder if Deuteronomy is actually challenging exactly the question that you're raising. And that's why so much, the reason I mentioned ethical monotheism is not necessarily because they're not separate. They are separate, but I think it may be because of what you're saying, Barbara, is that they can be linked to each other. And rather than thinking that I'm doing what God wants me to do, I should actually focus on doing what's right. And doing what's right may be the manifestation of the existence of God, whatever that is for the person who believes in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's also a non-religious answer to go back to his point, but okay, so you worked in a particular court. When you have one God, you've got one court. When you have multiple gods, you have multiple courts. So that's why, for example, Akhenaten, the Pharaoh of Egypt, banished all the other polytheistic gods and took one god in Amarna. And he wasn't Jewish, and we have an external history about that, because there are administrative advantages to not having all these disparate systems. And that helps you be ethical, because you get one and then you be careful how you do it. So they're related. They're not unrelated.
In terms of not necessarily the history of the Torah, but in just terms of history, broader history, was Deuteronomy concurrent with anything else
Yes.
being written?
I'm glad you asked. Page 1303. Okay, if we were doing this in more depth, we would actually sit and read together different passages from the book of Kings. But we don't have the time, and that's a whole different class. But I want to read with you, we're going to read both the introduction to this Haftorah and then the Haftorah itself. It's the Haftorah that is read on the second day of Passover in the diaspora, and I say in the diaspora because the second day of Passover in Israel is just the second day of Passover, it's not a Yontif. But on the second day of Passover, in the diaspora, we read this text from the second book, the Second Kings, which I want to frame for you in the following way. There was one united monarchy under which king? Who united the monarchy? David. Then Solomon, his son, builds a temple. Then after Solomon finishes his reign, one of his sons and another king, two guys named Jeroboam and Rehoboam, they split the kingdom. And we have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Okay. This northern kingdom falls in 722 BCE to who? The Assyrians. The Assyrians come down south and they try to conquer the southern kingdom, but kings like Josiah and Hezekiah in particular, they're able to evade it by hiding underground in the tunnels. And then in 587-86, the Babylonians come in. So to answer your question, Karen, this book of Deuteronomy is probably covering a historical period from the time of King David, or post-Exodus, to around the destruction of the first temple. And we're going to focus in on the southern kingdom after the destruction of the north. So I actually want to read with you the introduction to this Haftorah to give us some historical context. Lou,
Yes,
page 1303, would you read the two columns,
sure.
please? Does everyone see where we are, 1303?
If you don't laugh as I slough off the king's name in the third sentence, third line. Life in the kingdom of Judah was affected by events elsewhere in the world. The kingdom of Babylon, under King Nabopolassar, rebelled against Assyria in 626 BCE. This began a series of struggles that led to the fall of Assyria in 614 and of Nineveh in 612. Because of
Everyone
the
know
age-
Nineveh? What story do we have that's connected to
Jonah.
Nineveh? Jonah. Okay?
Because in the ancient world there was a close relationship between political freedom and national religious expression, one should not be surprised by the intriguing correlation between the fall of Assyria and the resurgence of religious reform in Judah. It may also explain a significant sequence of events during the time of King Josiah of Judah, 639 to 609
Now,
BCE.
I want to go back to Jerry's question for a second. Why, according to Jewish tradition, does the northern kingdom fall? It's not only because the Assyrians came in and conquered.
They were sinning.
They were sinning. And how do we know that? Who tells us? The prophets. First Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, whatever. They equate the fall of the north to their lack of practicing appropriately from a religious perspective. So after the northern kingdom falls, one of the things that the kings start doing is they re-implement religious practice and a connection to God, which would also include perhaps priestly service, in order to get people back on track. Okay, keep going, please.
According to 2 Chronicles, King Josiah underwent a religious awakening in the 8th year of his reign, 631 BCE. 4 years later, he began purifying the temple by ridding it of pagan features. 6 years after that, in the course of subsequent temple repairs, a book of the Torah was found, arguably Deuteronomy. This event led to a public renewal of the covenant and a great Pesach celebration for the entire nation.
Okay. As they are re-implementing all of these practices, they went down into the basement of the temple and they found this book called Sefer Habrit, the Book of the Covenant. And in there they realized, oh my goodness, there's all this stuff that we haven't been doing that we should have been doing. Let's re-implement it. Keep going.
There is a different account of this in 2 Kings, chapter 23, which puts the work of repair and the discovery of the Torah scroll before the acts of purification. It thus presents the finding of the Torah scroll as the reason for the religious reform. Most modern scholars regard this version of events as ideologically motivated to emphasize the role of the book in inspiring Josiah's pious enactment. By contrast, the account in Chronicles downplays the role of the book by linking the purification of worship to the report of Josiah's religious revival. This Haftarah, compared to the full historical presentations in Kings and Chronicles, is more concise. Thus, it does not even mention the temple repairs or the actual discovery of the book, which is related in 2 Kings 22.
Trying to get a doctor's appointment.
It specifies some of the acts of temple purification and concludes with a royal edict that Pesach be celebrated as prescribed in the scroll. The Haftarah begins with a national assembly, a public reading of the covenant scroll, and a communal renewal of the covenant.
By the way, one of the things that we learn about in the book of Deuteronomy is that we are supposed to have a public reading of Scripture. Right? It's not just enough to have the scroll. You actually need to write the scroll. Right? One of the commands that we come out of it is writing a Torah, which we'll reference on Sunday, but also to teach what's in the scroll for people so that they will practice it. It's not good for it to just live in the scroll. You actually have to do it, which is perhaps what Josiah realizes when he finds this scroll somewhere in the temple. Uh-oh, we haven't been doing it. Go ahead, please.
It then turns to the cultic purification program involving pagan artifacts, priests from Jerusalem, and Israelite shrines in the countryside with the eviction of their personnel to Jerusalem. It concludes with a national Pesach and a summary of all the great events. Each part of this sequence, initiated by the king, involves priestly and popular participation. Indeed, both the people and the king are said to have accepted God's covenant with all their heart and all their soul. This language is carefully chosen and evokes the great proclamation of the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, which calls on all Israelites to love God with all their heart and soul and might. This implies that now, in the days of Josiah, the people have committed themselves fully to that covenant, much as Moses had exhorted their ancestors to do before their entry into the land. The covenant ceremony at the outset of the Haftarah and the Pesach celebration at the end deserves special comment. This celebration of the covenant was not only a public recitation of the divine teaching, reminiscent of Moses' proclamation of Deuteronomy itself before his death and of Ezra's reading of the Torah of Moses on the return from Babylonian exile. It was the only time since Sinai that the whole nation publicly and collectively underwent a commitment to the divine covenant. Similarly, there had been nothing like the great Pesach celebration during the whole period of the judges and the kings. The first post-Exodus Pesach event of such collective importance had occurred in the time of Joshua, immediately on entrance into the land. The account of that event is recited as the Haftarah for the first day of Pesach.
All right. Yeah, you can stop.
Okay.
Okay. So what's the introduction telling us about the political landscape of this text? What's going on? What do we have? What do we not have? What hasn't there been for a while? What are they re-implementing? What's going on?
They haven't
had a Pesach, a Seder,
Since when?
since they left Egypt.
Since Joshua.
Since Joshua. Who's Joshua? He takes over. As soon as they get into the land and they conquer the land, they have a Passover. But pretty much from the time of Joshua until King Josiah, so we want to say maybe like, I don't know, 400 years or so, they haven't observed Passover. Why is Passover so important in Jewish tradition?
To remember the Exodus.
Which is all about what?
The giving of the,
Getting out of Egypt,
getting
getting the covenant. Meaning they've almost, in a way, lost their covenantal connection to God. And so, in finding this book, they have restored their covenant, which could suggest that the book was written earlier and lost, or maybe it was written a little bit later, but they hadn't been practicing it, and so the writing of this book helps them return to what they're supposed to do, which may also be the reason why in Deuteronomy over and over and over again we have this call to doing certain kinds of things because we were slaves in Egypt and God took us out, which may be the link that they're trying to make, which Barbara was suggesting before. Okay, what else do we have in the book of Deuteronomy that it highlights? What does it mean to have a covenant with God? We're supposed to do these things with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our soul, with all of our etc., which is the Shema. In which case, it makes sense why the Shema might have been inserted later as a way of trying to recalibrate us to what we were supposed to be doing, but had not been doing. Okay, so this is the story that we're going to look at. Why is Josiah important in terms of the authorship of Deuteronomy? If you can remember back to Friedman. What's Josiah's role? Remember, the northern kingdom has fallen. There's pagan stuff all over the place. What is Josiah trying to do?
Bring it all back to Jerusalem.
Bring them all back. Well, not just to Jerusalem.
Just rebuild the whole.
Rebuild it. He's trying to restart and reconnect and recommit the people back to the covenant, which is exactly what Moses is doing. On the shores of the Jordan, the whole generation that lost their way, the golden calf, the wandering, the spies, the whatever, he's got a new group of people now and he's trying to get them to recommit themselves.
Isn't it kind of unique for a king to be doing that? I mean,
Isn't it unique for a king to be doing that? Which, by the way, may get to Jerry's question about the whole God thing. Right? In Deuteronomy, what kind of laws do we have that are new? The laws of the king. Who is the king? How do you get a king? You know, how does the king rule? Prohibitions for the king. What are kings not supposed to have?
too many wives.
Too many wives.
Too big an army.
Too big an army. Too much money. Which, by the way, is the big criticism of Solomon.
In Trump.
I'm an expert in the Torah kind of thing. I'm not going to go down the political road.
But as well as religious unity, that also allows him to exert political power
Yes.
and bring about political
I'm glad that you brought that
unity.
up. Let's think about the structure of what we had when we leave Egypt. In the structure of when we leave Egypt, who's in charge? Moses. However, we looked at a couple of different threads of the story. Who might also have been in charge? Aaron. Why is it important that we know about both of them? According to the history? Yes, we have a priestly line that perhaps is coming from two different places, Mushite priests and Aaronic priests. And one of the things that we're going to see in Deuteronomy is that maybe one priestly line is emerging as victorious. If Moses dies and doesn't enter the land, who does that create space for to come to power? Aaron's line. Not only that, what happens after Moses dies? Who takes control? Joshua. Who takes control after Joshua? Judges. Who takes control after Judges? Kings.
But this is the first time we've really had a kind of a government.
Cor-
You see, prior we had leadership,
we had leadership.
but this is akin to government.
Yes, there's a governmental structure.
Yeah, which-
There's a monarchy.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is then, so his recommitting and reestablishing And it's different.
Yeah.
Because it is government and because it's so linked to Judaism.
Right? Right?
But it's moving from a tribal leadership form of government to a centralized government.
That's interesting, right? We've moved from a place of having 12 tribes, each of which get their own property, to now we have one united monarchy under David, to a divided monarchy north and south. The north has been kicked out. All we have left is the south. And the south is under the rule of one king. And ultimately, when they come back to Israel after the exile, they're going to have, again, some kind of united system that will probably all focus around the priests. So yes, this is in some way this perpetual struggle for who's in charge. By the way, to go back to Jerry's first point, if we're asking who's in charge from a human perspective, what are the people also asking? Who's in charge from a divine perspective? Is there a God that's in charge? Is there multiple God? Are there multiple gods that are in charge? Is it one God that's in charge?
Do you think the population is much larger now, after all these years?
Jewish population? No, I think it had gotten smaller.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So, this is a big part of the text of Deuteronomy. So the northern kingdom was destroyed. And they had this argument about, what version of God and how you practice. And the Samaritans got up to 2.5 million and they were dominant. And they made all these deals with the Assyrians, which let their religion kind of move around because you had to cut the deal. And then the northern kingdom is destroyed. And now all you're left with are these pretty pure Yahwists in this backwater Judea, which wasn't where anything was really going on. All of the productive capacity of Israel was kind of in the highlands and the northlands. So, and then Assyria asserted itself. So they took over the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom was made a vassal state of the Assyrians. I won't go further. I figure you have more on that you want to talk about.
I actually want to look at the text, because the text is going to inform a little bit about what their worldview was at the time under Josiah. By the way, when we talk about some of these kings, you're going to start noticing that their names tell you something. Okay? So Josiah, we're going to talk about Hilkiyahu, and then Yoshiyahu. Oops. And you'll notice they have a Yahwist name to them. Hezekiah is the same thing, Chizkiyahu. So in some way, a lot of the names that we might have had connected to El or to other gods are dropping out in terms of the text. We're getting references, even Isaiah, Yeshayahu, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. They're starting to emerge leaders that seem to be connected to one deity. Why? It's an interesting conversation for us to have over the course of the next couple of weeks, but there seems to be more connectedness to one God. Now, to your point, Jerry, I don't necessarily know that being connected to one God means that they're going to be ethical, or that being ethical means that you need to be attached to a deity. However, we're going to read the text now, and you're going to see that one of the first things that they do in this massive reconnection to the covenant is they get rid of a whole bunch of gods. So there's something going on theologically for them. Someone want to read chapter 23, page 1304? Please? Go ahead, Barbara.
At the king's summons, all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem assembled before him. And the king went up to the house of the Lord, together with all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and prophets, all the people young and old. And he read to them the entire text of the covenant scroll, which had been found in the house of the Lord.
Okay, so let's pause for a second and look what's happening. First of all, some geography. Where is this taking place? Jerusalem, which is where? In Judah. Okay, first important thing to know. Second, what are we calling this place? The house of Adonai, Beit Adonai, and we have a couple of references to it. And then what do they do with the text? They read it to them. Right? We're actually reading scripture to the people for them to hear.
So why is the king doing this, not the priests and the prophets?
It's a great question. Why is the king doing it, not the priest? Let's find out.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
I don't know if this is just the English translation or if the distinction is made in the Hebrew, but it says they were to gather up all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem.
Yeah,
which
so
would imply the women also.
it's a good question. So it says Ish, which would imply the masculine, and it says Yoshvei Yerushalayim, which means all those who inhabited. And there's an interesting distinction being made here as to, in terms of gender. If you look at the book of Ezra, in chapter 8, where Ezra officially initiates or institutes the public reading of Scripture, he goes out of his way to say that everyone needs to come, men, women, and children. So there is a distinction, and Ezra's in the kind of 5th century, 4th century, before the Common Era. There is a distinction that he makes there. So it could mean that we're talking gender specific.
It could mean that everybody who lived in Jerusalem could come because they were right there, but they didn't expect anybody to travel other than the men.
Right, and interesting, right, so it's not an invitation to those in exile, per se, but it does say everybody. It says, V'chol ha'am lemikaton v'ad gadol, and everyone in the people, from little to big.
All of the people.
Right?
Okay.
So it would seem to suggest that perhaps everyone was included, despite some of the gendered language.
Would there have been other than Jews or people of Hebrew
Well, that's
lineage
true.
there?
All the inhabitants.
Probably not.
Doesn't
Probably
mean-
anyone who's connected to the tribe of Judah, to the southern kingdom, to the priestly system. So probably not others. Yeah. Okay, keep going, Barbara, please.
The king stood by the pillar and solemnized the covenant before the Lord, that they would follow the Lord and observe his commandments, his injunctions, and his laws with all their heart and soul, that they would fulfill all the terms of his covenant as described upon the scroll, inscribed upon the scroll. And all the people entered into the covenant.
Okay, so why, per Jerry's question, why is the king doing this? Why is it not the priests?
The king has the power, and the people will listen to the king.
Okay. Why else?
Because some of the priests didn't do the right thing.
We don't know what's going on with the priests, and you're going to see in just a second, it's the king who has to reappoint the priests to go back to work.
We're out of the priest period now. We're into the king period. So the king took over after the priest period.
That's right. We're going to go back to the priest period kind of after the destruction of the first temple, but in general, the priests have not been doing what they were supposed to be doing.
And the king has the ability to enforce this.
Yes?
The
Right.
priests
He does,
don't
but
really.
historically the king was not in charge of the religion. He was in charge of ruling the people.
Except if
that's
no
true.
one is actually doing the religion,
Right.
which is, I think, what this is suggesting.
And some of these priests were involved with idolatry.
This is a kind of a coronation, actually.
It is.
What
I mean,
about the prophets?
it's an effort to assert authority. I'm just wondering. I keep bringing up the political context.
Yep.
And, are we talking about a time when it's really necessary to unify the people? Because if not, they get subdued more rapidly. I mean, is what this is just an effort to have to develop a loyal following? You know, a speech to the convinced. To go to Minnesota and gather people around you who voted for you, and to kind of rally the troops.
Yeah, I think this is about unity. I think it's about recommitting to the tradition after a pretty devastating loss. Right? This is coming on the heels of the fall of the Northern Kingdom. So I think to some degree, yeah, it's right. And around the central system of worship, the temple still exists, but it's not necessarily being used the way that it once had been.
I also think that this links the king to divine authority.
Yeah.
And sort of
Specifically, which
adds
divine
to-
authority?
Yahweh.
Right, Yahweh. Now, why that king as opposed to, why that God as opposed to another God, not clear to me. But perhaps it's because that's what they have been influenced by from previous texts and previous
Well,
history.
it doesn't say that he says his authority comes from God, but it's implied.
Well, they're at least
There's a
calling,
language.
yes, there's a language that's linking it in some way. Phil?
The other thing too is my understanding is that this is around 900 BCE-ish.
This story?
That it was
7th century.
7th century, so 600s.
Yeah, mid-600s, yeah.
Because there was a consolidation of text, and my understanding is that his innovation was that everybody was not, they were non-literate societies until Josiah.
Right,
And
yes.
Josiah created the book, were the people of the book, and that everybody was expected to read it. And widespread literacy they were the first society to have widespread literacy, which has a practical aspect.
Right.
Because if you can write and read, then you can do commerce, you can be an accountant, you could be a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer.
Right.
Mothers were much happier after Josiah.
Jewish mothers.
Jewish brothers, right? Yeah.
Now it's Josiah or Hosiah?
Josiah.
Tell me about this text that was found in the house of the Lord, because it sounds like what the Mormons did. That they found,
With the book of Joseph, was it
Yeah,
Joseph?
they found this text.
No, but it's the book of the prophet Joseph the prophet.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith.
Yeah, Joseph Smith. Thank you.
Didn't you find it in the backyard or something?
Well, yeah, I mean that's kind of what it is. So there's an interesting question here about what is this book, and when did it get written? And a lot of people posit that the book that they found was a book that had already written, or maybe somebody was writing it at the time and they kind of slipped it in and said, "Oh, guys, check this out." But most scholars seem to suggest that this is what we call today modern, what we would call today Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, that fifth book of the Torah, that seems to have clear connection to the previous books, but maybe from a historical period that's different, meaning we have similar characters and similar content, but different perspective, different voice, different audience, different goals. And it was a way of suggesting that we'd somehow lost our connection to the books that came before.
So-
Jerry, you look puzzled.
No, I mean, I'm just thinking, what if we discovered some book, dug it up somewhere and it had all this stuff in it? Why are we going to believe it just because it's an old book?
Right?
They
They
didn't.
weren't as cynical as we are.
Well, they,
They had not been subjected to fake news at that point.
And alternative facts.
And
Of course, truth
Had
truth was truth.
Right, had it been found and put on social media, we wouldn't have believed it.
who decided that Deuteronomy was part of the Torah then?
Yeah, that's a great
If
question.
if it has that gap.
Yeah, let's hold it for a second. Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, it's not today, but the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in modern times and people believed them,
Right.
that they're authentic.
What does the word Deuteronomy mean?
So what's Deutero?
second.
Second.
Second,
Ah,
So the second teaching,
okay.
or the second telling. Right. Okay, let's see what the king tells us to do.
Then the king ordered the high priest Hilkiah, the priests of the second rank, and the guards of the threshold to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the objects made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he removed the ashes to Bethel. He suppressed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to make offerings at the shrines in the towns of Judah and in the environs of Jerusalem, and those who made offerings to Baal, to the sun and moon and constellations, all the host of heaven. He brought out the image of Asherah from the house of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem, and burned it in the Kidron Valley. He beat it to dust and scattered its dust over the burial ground of the common people. He tore down the cubicles of the male prostitutes in the house of the Lord, at the place where the woman wove coverings for Asherah. He brought all the priests from the towns of Judah to Jerusalem and defiled the shrines where the priests had been making offerings, from Geba to Beersheba. He also demolished the shrines of the gates, which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the city prefect, which were on a person's left upon entering the city gate. The priests of the shrines, however, did not ascend the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread along with their kinsmen.
Okay, does this sound like another story that we know? Sorry, I'll say it a different way. What story does this remind us of? We know.
It actually
The golden
reminds
calf?
me of Jesus,
A little bit early.
who didn't like what the priests were doing
Yeah.
and tried to stop them.
So you might, I actually don't know this for sure, but maybe it was read the other way, meaning maybe the people around that time period read this story and connected them. But we're definitely a good 500 to 600 years prior to Jesus, but I heard you say it.
The golden
The
calf.
golden calf. And I think what we're going to start to see is that the reason that they're going to connect Deuteronomy to the rest of the 4 books of the Torah is that there is this eerie connection or reliving of stuff that had already happened before. As if to say, the people had put all of these things in place, all of these idols for other gods, all of these other things that shouldn't be, And now we have to go and get rid of them, which is exactly what happens when Moses comes down the mountain and he sees it. He's got to go destroy and beat it down and burn it and yada, yada, yada. And so there's a whole ritual cleansing that is taking place. Again, it's an interesting thing going back to your question, Jerry, which is there seems to be the getting rid of, the removal of other gods. Somehow those gods get in the way of some kind of appropriate behavior or practice. So there's some linkage that's been made. Go ahead.
So, first of all, there's some amazing stuff in here.
Yeah.
Sure.
But, what it really sounds to me like is a coup d'etat.
Could be.
Like there's, this, is it Josiah?
Mm-hmm.
Josiah is in a struggle for power. He finds a book which coronates him, and then he gets rid of all the
Stuff that gets in his way.
whoever, whatever and whoever is in his way.
I mean, can I give you a different alternative? The
Of course,
the
I'd love
Northern
to.
Kingdom was ruined because of their pagan ways, and they tried to deal with those pagans, and look what it did for them. And now there are all these foreign remnants in our land of what destroyed half of us. And if we don't root out that poison, it's going to destroy us too.
And I don't think that's mutually exclusive. I think that
Right.
that
Right.
all fits together.
I'm shocked that there were cubicles for male prostitutes in the temple.
So what story does that remind us of?
But that was a female prostitute.
Doesn't matter. Where else in the Torah do we have stories of certain individuals rooting out cult prostitution because of its inappropriateness? Pinchas does it. Right? Pinchas, in his zealotry, which by the way is praised by God, sees Israelites engaging with prostitutes and engaging with people of other faiths, and he goes and he slaughters them. I'm not saying that it's ethical to kill them, but there seems to be this rooting out of what would seemingly be inappropriate behavior and practice, which were among the things that the earlier prophets were warning against in the Northern Kingdom.
But this would imply male prostitutes for men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, we
So
have
that's even worse.
there's male prostitution and sodomy and things like that earlier in the Torah.
What's also interesting, and I just looked it up because I was intrigued by who was this Asherah.
Asherah, yeah.
Was the female consort of El,
Mhm.
and so
Yes.
they're really
Oh, is
getting
that-
rid of El.
They are getting rid of El, and if you look at it, look at
And
verse.
more than that, Asherah existed before El because she
Right.
was the fertility goddess.
That's right. If you look at verse 4, look at verse 4 for a second. Ordering the high priest Hilkiah and the second rank priests and all the guards or whatever to get rid of all of the objects for Baal and Asherah. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he removed the ashes to Bethel. Wait, where do we first have Bethel?
And God is here, is when he slept with the
That's right.
pillow of
This is in
rocks.
Jacob's dream. Jacob dreams the ladder, angels going up and down. He's leaving the space, and he names that place Bethel. What does Jacob's new name become? Israel. This is a reaction, in a way, of all of the gods connected to El and getting rid of them and the emergence of Beit Adonai. Now, why do we need to go to one god over another god? Why do we need to get rid of the other gods? All interesting questions, but presumably, according to at least the text, they get in the way. They're not directing people to a certain kind of behavior, and so they need to be purged.
Because Elohism was not an ethical religious structure, to answer his question.
Say why.
El didn't really, El just cared that you did for him and maintained his power structure, and you served him faithfully. There was no ethics in that religious structure.
Presumably.
Like for example, the sacrifice of Isaac. It's El that tells him to go kill his son, and it's Yahweh.
And it's
that
Yahweh that intervenes.
holds his hand.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, so Barbara, will you just read the end of this text, and then we'll pause for the day?
The king commanded all the people, offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God as prescribed in the scroll of the covenant. Now the Passover sacrifice had not been offered in that manner in the days of the chieftains who ruled Israel, or during the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. Only in the 18th year of King Josiah was such a Passover sacrifice offered in that manner to the Lord in Jerusalem. Josiah also did away with the necromancers and the mediums, the idols and the fetishes, all the detestable things that were to be seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem. Thus he fulfilled the terms of the teaching recorded in the scroll that the priest Hilkiah had found in the house of the Lord. There was no king like him before who turned back to the Lord with all his heart and soul and might, in full accord with the teaching of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him.
All right. Now this may be the link to the other 4 books. Starting in verse 24, I'm looking at the last line of 1305. It says, Lama'an hakim et divrei haTorah haktuvim al hasefer, which means all of the things that were inside the Torah, the instruction that were written in this book, right, that Hilkiah had found in the house of the Lord, as if to suggest that it was the priest who found it. There had never been another king who had returned with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might. And there wasn't anyone who came to be like Moses, and there wouldn't be anyone thereafter. And so this linkage here back to Moses, from Moses' time to Josiah's time, and the reconnection to the covenant, which may have been what Moses was trying to impart, at least in the opening parts of Deuteronomy. Remember, we said Deuteronomy has 3 distinct sections to it. May be the reason why this book gets lumped back together and becomes the round out of the Pentateuch. There's some connection to the way that Josiah reigns and reorients the people back to what they're supposed to do that is reminiscent of what Moses was trying to do before the people enter Israel. And the language is eerily similar. It's only in Deuteronomy that we get the idea of loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And in particular, the connectedness to one God, namely the God of Adonai. Okay, so let's pause here. Next week we will dig into some of the pieces. We'll look at some comparisons of the two texts of the 10 Commandments. We'll look at the Shema a little bit and what's going on there, and we'll kind of look at a couple pieces of the 3 breakdowns of Deuteronomy. Okay? So next week we'll do that. The following week, which is the week before Rosh Hashanah, we'll do a little Rosh Hashanah stuff.
Sure.
And then we